On a crisp autumn afternoon, when leaves danced in the gentle breeze and the sun cast long shadows across Central Park, a small figure in a bright yellow backpack caught many people's attention. Maya, a cheerful 11-year-old with beaded braids and warm brown eyes, was taking her usual route home from school. Her mom always said she took the long way through the park, but Maya loved watching the pigeons and feeling the crunch of leaves under her feet. Today was special because her mom had packed her favorite lunch, 2 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches instead of 1. "For my growing girl," the little note in her lunchbox had said. Maya had saved the second sandwich, thinking she'd enjoy it while doing her homework later. As she skipped past the old chess tables where elderly men usually played their daily games, something unusual caught her eye. There, on the last bench, partially hidden by an oak tree, sat an older white man. His clothes were worn and dirty, his gray beard unkempt, and beside him lay a small, tattered backpack that had clearly seen better days. What struck Maya wasn't just how he looked. It was how everyone else looked at him, or rather, how they tried so hard not to look at him at all. Business people in suits walked by staring at their phones. Joggers suddenly found interesting things to look at in the opposite direction. Even the usually friendly dog walkers crossed to the other side of the path. Maya slowed her steps, watching as the man's shoulders slumped lower with each person who passed by. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he tried to warm them by rubbing them together. The autumn air had turned chilly, and he wore only a thin jacket. Her mom had always taught her to be careful around strangers, but she'd also taught her something else, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show kindness when everyone else chooses to look away. Maya remembered the story her grandmother often told her about receiving help from a stranger when she first came to this country, and how that one act of kindness had given her the strength to keep going. Maya felt the weight of her second sandwich in her backpack. Her stomach gave a little grumble, reminding her she'd been looking forward to that sandwich all afternoon. But something in her heart spoke louder than her hungry stomach. Taking a deep breath, Maya adjusted her backpack and walked over to the bench. She stayed at a safe distance, just like her parents had taught her, but close enough to speak. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, but clear enough to be heard. The man looked up, startled that someone was actually speaking to him. His blue eyes were clouded with sadness, but they held a gentle spark that reminded Maya of her favorite school librarian. When their eyes met, she saw something else too. Surprise, certainly, but also a flash of embarrassment and what looked like shame. "I have an extra sandwich," Maya said, already reaching into her backpack. "My mom always says sharing food tastes better than eating alone." She pulled out the carefully wrapped sandwich, still neat in its paper napkin. "Would you like to share it with me?" The simple question hung in the air between them, bridging a gap that society had created. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The passing crowds, the rustling leaves, the distant sound of traffic. It was just 2 humans, one small act of kindness, and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. That's how it all began. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with a little girl who chose to see a person when others saw a problem. Neither Maya nor the man knew it yet, but this chance encounter on an ordinary autumn day would spark a chain of events that would touch not just their lives, but their entire community. The man stared at the sandwich in Maya's outstretched hand for what felt like forever. His weathered face showed a mix of emotions: disbelief, gratitude, and something that looked like shame. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough from lack of use. "Don't you need it?" Maya shook her head, her beaded braids swaying gently. "I already had lunch. This is extra." She placed the sandwich on the bench between them, keeping a respectful distance just as her parents had taught her. The man's hand shook slightly as he reached for it, and Maya noticed his fingers were red from the cold. "Thank you," he whispered, carefully unwrapping the sandwich as if it were made of gold. I can't remember the last time someone looked me in the eye, let alone shared their food with me." He took a small bite, and Maya saw tears forming in his eyes. A cool breeze rustled through the park, making Maya zip up her jacket. She noticed how the man pulled his thin coat tighter around himself. Other people continued walking past, some now staring at the unusual sight of a young black girl talking to a homeless white man. Maya didn't care. Her grandmother always said that kindness doesn't see color or class. "I'm Maya," she said, sitting on the far end of the bench. "I walk through the park every day after school." She paused, then added, "You look cold. Would you like half of my hot chocolate too?" She pulled out her small thermos, another treat her mom had packed that day. The man's hands trembled even more as he accepted the thermos cap filled with warm chocolate. "I'm Thomas," he said softly, "and you remind me of someone I used to help a long time ago." He took a sip, and for a moment, his eyes seemed far away. "Were you a teacher?" Maya asked, noticing how he held the thermos cap carefully, like her teachers did with their coffee cups during morning sessions. Thomas shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. "I was a doctor. A children's doctor. I helped sick kids get better." His voice cracked a little. "That was before everything changed." Maya's eyes widened. She'd never met a doctor who lived on a park bench before. She thought about Dr. Chen, her pediatrician, with his neat office and friendly smile. How did someone go from helping sick children to sitting alone in the park? "What happened?" she asked gently, the way her mom did when Maya was upset about something at school. Thomas took another bite of the sandwich, chewing slowly as if gathering his thoughts. "Life can change so fast," he finally said. "My wife got sick. Cancer. I spent all our savings trying to save her, but..." He trailed off, looking at the ground. "After she was gone, I couldn't focus on work. Made some mistakes. Lost my license. Then our house. It's amazing how quickly you can lose everything you thought was permanent." Maya listened, her heart feeling heavy, but also full of something else, a determination to help. She thought about her own family, how they stuck together through tough times, how her mom always said that sometimes people just need someone to believe in them again. "But you still know all that doctor stuff, right?" Maya asked, an idea forming in her mind. All that knowledge didn't go away. Thomas looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. "No, I suppose it didn't. 20 years of medical knowledge doesn't just disappear." For the first time, a hint of pride crept into his voice. "Then maybe that's where we start," Maya said firmly, sounding much older than her 11 years. "My mom says everyone deserves a second chance. They just need someone to give it to them." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, neither Maya nor Thomas realized that this simple conversation, sparked by a shared sandwich, was the beginning of something much bigger than both of them. Sometimes the greatest changes in life start with the smallest acts of kindness, offered without expectation or judgment. And while others hurried past, rushed in their daily routines, a unique friendship was forming on that park bench, one that would soon prove that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes all it takes to restart a life is a child's simple act of compassion. That evening, Maya couldn't stop thinking about Thomas. As she sat at the dinner table with her parents, pushing her green beans around her plate, she kept seeing his sad eyes and trembling hands. Her mom noticed something was different. Mothers always do. "Baby, you're quieter than usual tonight," her mom said, reaching over to feel her forehead. "Are you feeling okay?" Maya took a deep breath. She knew she had to tell them about Thomas, but she wasn't sure how they'd react. Her parents had always taught her to be careful around strangers, but they'd also taught her about compassion and helping others. "I met someone today," she started slowly, watching her parents exchange glances. "In the park. He's a doctor. Well, he used to be a doctor. A children's doctor." The words tumbled out faster now, like water breaking through a dam. She told them about the sandwich, about Thomas's story, about his wife, and how he lost everything. Her dad put down his fork, his face serious. "Maya, honey, While it's kind of you to want to help, we've talked about approaching strangers. It could be dangerous. But Dad, Maya protested, he's not dangerous. He's just lost. Like that time you told me about when Grandpa helped you find a job after the factory closed. Someone believed in you then, right? Her parents shared another look, this one longer and filled with meaning. Her mom reached across the table and took Maya's hand. Tell us more about him. So Maya did. She told them how Thomas's hand shook when he took the sandwich, how his eyes filled with tears at simple kindness, how he spoke about his years helping sick children with a mix of pride and deep sadness. As she talked, she saw her parents' expression slowly change from concern to something softer. 20 years of medical experience, her dad murmured thoughtfully. That's not something that should go to waste. Maya's mom, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, was quiet for a moment. You know, she said slowly, the community clinic is always looking for volunteers. They have a program for medical professionals who've fallen on hard times. That night, Maya could hardly sleep. Her mind was full of possibilities. She thought about all the kids Thomas must have helped during his career, all the knowledge he still had locked away inside him. It wasn't right that someone who had spent their life helping others should end up alone on a park bench. The next morning, before school, Maya's mom made an extra lunch, not just a sandwich, but a full meal packed carefully in a paper bag. If you see him today, she said, giving Maya a hug, tell him there are people who want to help. Tell him to come to the community clinic on Oak Street. Ask him to at least talk to them. Maya hugged the paper bag to her chest all morning at school, keeping it safe. Her best friend noticed and asked what was so special about her lunch. Maya thought about how to explain it. Sometimes, she said finally, you meet someone who just needs to be reminded that they matter. That's what my grandma always says. Everyone matters, even when they forget it themselves. After school, Maya practically ran to the park, her heart pounding. Would Thomas be there? What if he'd moved on? But there he was, on the same bench, looking even more tired than yesterday. When he saw Maya approaching, though, his face lit up with a small smile. I was hoping you'd come back, he said softly. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday. Maya sat down, placing the paper bag between them. My mom packed this for you, she said, and she wants me to tell you something important. She took a deep breath, remembering her mom's words. There are people who want to help Thomas. Real help, not just food. The community clinic on Oak Street. They have a program. My mom works at the hospital, and she says they help doctors who've had hard times. Thomas stared at the paper bag, then at Maya, his eyes wide with an emotion she couldn't quite name. For a moment, she worried he might cry again. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, just a little, like someone who's been carrying a heavy weight and suddenly feels it lighten. Your mom. He paused, his voice rough. Your family would do that. For a stranger? Maya smiled, feeling hope bubble up inside her. You're not a stranger anymore, she said simply. You're my friend. And friends help each other get back up when they fall. Over the next few weeks, something beautiful began to unfold in the park. Every day after school, Maya would find Thomas on his bench, but small changes were starting to show. His beard was neater now, trimmed at the free community barber service. His clothes, while still worn, were cleaner thanks to the local shelter's laundry program. But the biggest change was in his eyes. That spark of hope was growing stronger each day. Maya's mom had helped Thomas get an appointment at the community clinic. The staff there remembered him. Some had even read research papers he'd written years ago about treating childhood asthma. When they discovered his extensive knowledge of pediatric medicine, they offered him a volunteer position, helping to organize their medical records and advising on complex cases. One chilly afternoon, as Maya approached the bench with her usual after-school snack to share, she found Thomas standing instead of sitting. He was wearing a clean button-down shirt that Maya's dad had given him, and his gray hair was combed neatly. I did it, he said, his voice trembling with excitement. I just finished my first day helping at the clinic. His hands were steady as he showed Maya a temporary volunteer badge with his name on it. The director said if things go well, they might help me work toward getting my license back. Maya bounced on her toes, barely containing her joy. Tell me everything. Did you help any kids today? Thomas's face lit up as he sat down, patting the bench beside him. I didn't treat any patients directly. I can't do that yet. But there was this little boy with breathing problems. The doctor was puzzled about the treatment plan, and I suggested looking into environmental factors. Turns out, the family had just moved to a new apartment with a mold problem. He paused, his eyes misty. It felt so good to help, even in a small way. Word about Thomas spread through the neighborhood. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped to chat. Mrs. Chen from the bakery started bringing him day-old bread and pastries. Mr. Rodriguez, who ran the coffee shop, would bring him hot coffee on cold mornings before his clinic shifts. But it wasn't all easy. Some days, Thomas would seem smaller, quieter, weighted down by memories of all he'd lost. On those days, Maya would sit with him longer, sometimes just in silence, sharing her cookies or telling him about her day at school. You know what's funny? Thomas said one afternoon, watching the pigeons hop around their feet. When I was a successful doctor, I had hundreds of colleagues, a big house, expensive cars. But I never had a true friend like you, Maya. Someone who saw me at my worst and still believed in me. Maya thought about this as she munched on her cookie. My teacher says sometimes we have to lose everything to learn what really matters. Like in those stories where the rich person becomes poor but finds out that love and friendship are worth more than money. Thomas chuckled, a sound that was becoming more common these days. Your teacher is very wise. And you know what? When I was at my lowest point, sitting on this bench day after day, it wasn't another doctor or a social worker who helped me first. It was a little girl with a peanut butter sandwich and a heart bigger than this whole park. A group of kids playing nearby caught Maya's attention. One of them had fallen and scraped their knee. Without thinking, Thomas stood up, his doctor's instincts kicking in. He approached carefully, spoke softly to the crying child, and expertly checked the scrape. You're going to be just fine, he assured the kid, pulling a clean tissue from his pocket to dab at the scratch. The child's mother, who had rushed over, watched in amazement as Thomas calmly handled the situation. Are you a doctor? She asked, noting his professional manner. Thomas glanced at Maya, who gave him an encouraging nod. Yes, he said, standing a little straighter. Yes, I am. I'm working at the community clinic now, getting back on my feet. As Maya watched this scene unfold, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was the Thomas she'd seen all along, hidden beneath the sadness and worn clothes. A healer, a helper, someone who still had so much to give to the world. All he'd needed was someone to believe in him again. The story of Maya and Thomas began to spread through the neighborhood like a gentle wave, touching hearts and changing minds. It started with small whispers at the local coffee shop, grew through conversations at the supermarket, and soon reached the local newspaper. A young reporter, fresh out of journalism school, heard about their story and knew it was something special. One crisp morning, as Thomas was helping organize medical supplies at the clinic, the reporter came to interview them both. Maya sat next to Thomas, her legs swinging from the chair that seemed a bit too tall for her. Her mom stood nearby, watching proudly as her daughter told their story. I just saw someone who looked hungry and sad, Maya explained simply, shrugging her shoulders. Mom always says that when you have food to share, you should share it. The reporter turned to Thomas, who now wore a clean volunteer coat with a proper ID badge. His eyes grew misty as he described that first day in the park. I had lost all hope, he admitted, his voice soft but steady. When you've been invisible to people for so long, you start to believe that's all you'll ever be. But then this amazing child just saw me, really saw me. The story appeared in the Sunday paper with a photo of Maya and Thomas sitting on their park bench. sharing cookies. The headline read, "A Sandwich, a Second Chance. How One Child's Kindness Changed a Community." The impact was immediate and overwhelming. The clinic's phone started ringing with calls from other medical professionals wanting to volunteer. Local businesses began reaching out, asking how they could help people in similar situations, but most touching were the letters that started arriving at the clinic for Thomas. "Dear Dr. Thomas," one letter read, "20 years ago, you saved my daughter's life when no other doctor could figure out what was wrong with her. We never got to thank you properly. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to help you now." More former patients came forward, each with their own story of how Thomas had helped them or their children. People who remembered him from his practicing days spoke about his gentleness, his patience, his ability to calm frightened children with just a few kind words. The clinic director was moved by these testimonials. She called a meeting with the medical board and presented a plan to help Thomas regain his medical license. It wouldn't be easy. There would be supervised practice, examinations, and careful monitoring. But it was possible. When Thomas heard the news, he broke down crying. Maya, who was there for her daily after-school visit, rushed to hug him. "Are they happy tears or sad tears?" she asked, worried. "Happy tears, sweetheart," Thomas said, wiping his eyes. "Very happy tears. But you know what makes me even happier? Knowing that I can help other people who are where I was, people who just need someone to believe in them again." The community continued to rally around Thomas. A local apartment owner offered him a small but clean place to live at a reduced rent. The coffee shop owner hired him part-time to help cover his expenses while he worked toward getting his license back. Even Maya's school invited him to give a talk about medicine and the importance of kindness. But perhaps the most beautiful change was in how people in the neighborhood began treating others who were struggling. The sandwich shop started a pay-it-forward wall where customers could buy extra meals for those who couldn't afford them. The library created a job resource center. The community center began offering free medical checkups. One afternoon, as Maya and Thomas sat on their usual bench sharing cookies, they watched a businesswoman stop to talk to a homeless man instead of hurrying past. She sat down, offered him a coffee, and listened to his story. "Look," Maya said, nudging Thomas. "It's spreading." Thomas smiled, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's the thing about kindness," he said softly. "It's like a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples keep going, touching everything in their path. And it all started with one little girl and half a sandwich." Maya leaned against his arm, feeling proud but also understanding something important about how the world works. Sometimes the biggest changes don't start with grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes they start with the simplest acts of human kindness, like sharing your lunch with someone who needs it more than you do. One morning, something extraordinary happened at the community clinic. Dr. Chen, the head of pediatrics at the city's biggest children's hospital, walked through the doors. He had read about Thomas in the newspaper and recognized him immediately. They had attended medical school together 30 years ago. Thomas was organizing patient files when he heard a familiar voice. "Still color-coding your folders, I see. Some habits never change." He looked up to find his old classmate standing there, older but with the same friendly smile he remembered from their study groups. The reunion was emotional. The two men hugged, both with tears in their eyes. Dr. Chen had always wondered what had happened to his brilliant friend who had mysteriously disappeared from the medical community years ago. Now, reading about Thomas's story and Maya's role in his recovery, he knew he had to help. "The hospital needs someone with your expertise," Dr. Chen said, pulling up a chair. "We're starting a new program for underprivileged children with chronic illnesses. Once you get your license back, we could use your experience. These kids need someone who understands what it's like to fall down and get back up." Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. "But my history, the gaps in my practice." Dr. Chen waved away his concerns. "You're exactly what we need. Someone who's been through hardship, who knows what it's like to need help. Besides," he smiled, I remember how you could diagnose complex cases that left the rest of us scratching our heads. When Maya arrived at the clinic that afternoon after school, she found Thomas sitting quietly, lost in thought. "What's wrong?" she asked, pulling out her usual snack to share. "Did something bad happen?" Thomas shook his head, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "No, something amazing happened. Remember how you told me that sometimes good things come from unexpected places?" He explained about Dr. Chen's visit and the opportunity at the children's hospital. Maya's eyes grew wide with excitement. "You'll be a real doctor again, working in a big hospital." "If I can complete my recertification," Thomas nodded. "It won't be easy. There's so much new research, new procedures to learn. I'll have to study harder than I ever have before." "Then we'll study together," Maya declared. "I have homework every day anyway. You can use my flashcards method. It helps me remember things for tests." That's how their study sessions began. Every afternoon, Maya would spread her homework across one end of their park bench, while Thomas reviewed medical journals at the other end. She would quiz him on medical terms while he helped her with her math problems. People passing by would smile at the unusual sight: a young girl and an older man, both absorbed in their books, occasionally sharing a sandwich or a laugh. The local library noticed their daily study sessions and offered Thomas a quiet room to use after hours. Soon, other medical professionals from the community clinic joined in, turning it into an informal study group. They brought coffee and snacks, sharing knowledge and encouragement as Thomas prepared for his recertification exams. Maya's mom helped too, bringing home practice questions from the hospital where she worked. Her dad spent weekends helping Thomas set up a small desk in his new apartment, creating a proper study space. The whole community seemed invested in his success. One evening, as Thomas walked Maya and her parents to their car after a study session, he stopped suddenly. "You know," he said, looking at the family who had helped change his life, "a year ago, I thought my story was over. I thought I was too old, too broken to start again. But Maya taught me something important that day with the sandwich. She taught me that every day is a chance to begin again, to rewrite your story." Maya's mom squeezed his hand. "And look how many people you're inspiring now. The clinic tells me they have 5 other former medical professionals in their volunteer program, all working toward getting back on their feet. That's because of you," Maya said proudly. "You showed them it's possible." As they drove home that evening, Maya watched Thomas walking back to his apartment, his medical books tucked under his arm, his head held high. She thought about how different he looked from the man she'd first met on the park bench. It wasn't just the clean clothes or the trimmed beard, it was the hope in his eyes, the purpose in his step. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "I think sometimes people just need someone to remind them who they really are. Like when you clean off a really dirty window and let the light shine through again." Her mom smiled in the rearview mirror. "That's exactly right, baby. And sometimes it takes a child's simple kindness to clean that window." The big day finally arrived. Thomas's medical board examination. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that reminded him of when he first met Maya. He stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the tie Maya's dad had given him for good luck. His hands weren't shaking anymore. The whole community had helped him prepare for this moment. The coffee shop had stayed open late so he could study there. The librarian had ordered special medical textbooks. Even the local study group had organized mock examinations to help him practice. Maya had made him a special card, decorated with glitter and drawings of stethoscopes. Inside, she'd written, "You were always a doctor in your heart. Now everyone else will remember it too." He kept it in his pocket, touching it occasionally for courage. As he walked to the examination center, he passed their park bench. To his surprise, Maya was there with her parents, holding a sign that read, "You can do it, Dr. Thomas." Several other people from the neighborhood were there too. The coffee shop owner, the librarian, some of his fellow volunteers from the clinic. They all cheered when they saw him. "But it's a school day," Thomas said to Maya, confused but touched. Maya grinned. Mom called the school. She said this was an important life lesson about never giving up. Her mom nodded, smiling proudly at her daughter. The examination was grueling. 6 hours of intense questions, case studies, and practical evaluations. But every time Thomas felt overwhelmed, he thought of the card in his pocket, of Maya's unwavering belief in him, of all the people who had helped him get this far. During one particularly challenging case study, he remembered something Maya had said during their study sessions. When I get stuck on a hard problem, I close my eyes and pretend I'm explaining it to someone else. It helps me think better. He did just that, and the answer came to him clearly. When he finally emerged from the examination room, exhausted but hopeful, he found not just Maya and her family waiting, but a small crowd of supporters. The clinic staff had come during their lunch break. Some former patients who had written letters about him were there too. Even Dr. Chen had stopped by. "How did it go?" Maya asked, bouncing with anticipation. Thomas took a deep breath. "I did my best. That's all I could do." He looked around at all the faces smiling back at him. "But whatever happens, I've already won something more valuable than any medical license." "What's that?" Maya asked. "I found my family," he said softly. "Not by blood, but by kindness. And that's just as real." 2 weeks later, Thomas received the envelope he'd been waiting for. He took it to the park bench, their bench, where Maya was waiting after school. Together, they opened it. "Dear Dr. Thomas," Maya read aloud, her voice getting more excited with each word. "We are pleased to inform you that you have successfully completed all requirements for reinstatement of your medical license." She didn't finish reading because Thomas had burst into tears, and she was hugging him tightly. People walking by stopped to ask what was happening. And soon a small celebration broke out right there in the park. Mrs. Chen from the bakery rushed over with cookies. Mr. Rodriguez brought coffee for everyone. But the biggest surprise came from Dr. Chen, who arrived with more news. The Children's Hospital wasn't just offering Thomas a job. They wanted him to lead a new program helping other medical professionals who had fallen on hard times find their way back to practice. "We're calling it the Bridge Program," Dr. Chen explained, "because sometimes people just need a bridge to help them cross from where they are to where they could be." He smiled at Maya. And it all started because a little girl built the first bridge with half a sandwich. That evening, as the impromptu celebration continued in the park, Thomas watched Maya playing with some other children. She was teaching them a clapping game, her laughter carrying across the grass. He thought about how much his life had changed since that first day when she'd approached his bench. "You know," he said to Maya's parents, who stood nearby, "I used to think I lost everything. But maybe I had to lose it all to find something better. A community, a purpose, a chance to help others who are lost like I was." Maya's mom squeezed his hand. "That's the thing about kindness," she said. "It has a way of multiplying. One small act can grow into something bigger than we ever imagined." 6 months flew by like pages turning in a storybook. Thomas's office at the Children's Hospital had a special wall covered with children's drawings and thank you notes. But in the center was Maya's original glitter-covered good luck card, framed and hung with pride. It reminded him every day of how his journey back began. The Bridge Program was changing lives in ways nobody had expected. Thomas had already helped 5 other doctors and nurses return to medicine. Each one had their own story. A dentist who'd lost his practice during an illness, a nurse who'd become homeless after caring for her sick mother, a pediatrician who'd struggled with depression after losing a young patient. One quiet afternoon, while Thomas was reviewing files, his office door creaked open. Maya peeked in, wearing her backpack and carrying her usual after-school snack. She still visited him every day, but now instead of meeting at the park bench, she came to his bright office with its view of the city. "Guess what?" she said, pulling out her math test. "I got an A. And I used your method, breaking down the big problem into smaller parts, just like you do with tough medical cases." Thomas smiled proudly. "That's wonderful. You know, You're teaching me as much as I'm teaching you." He pointed to a new photo on his wall, a group picture of the Bridge program's first successful candidates. "See that smile on Dr. Wilson's face? That's because she gets to help patients again, just like she always dreamed." Maya studied the photo. "Remember when you were scared to even tell people you used to be a doctor?" she asked. "Now look at you. You're helping other doctors be brave again." Just then, there was a knock at the door. A woman in worn clothes stood there, clutching a newspaper clipping. I read about your program," she said nervously. "I was a physical therapist before everything fell apart." Thomas immediately stood up, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "Please, come in. Would you like some tea? Maya, could you get us those cookies your mom sent?" Maya watched as Thomas listened to the woman's story with the same kindness she'd shown him months ago. When the woman started crying while explaining how she'd lost her job and then her home, Thomas handed her a tissue and said gently, "Your story isn't over. It's just taking a different path than you expected." After the woman left with information about the program and a spark of hope in her eyes, Maya helped Thomas update his files. "You know what's cool?" she said thoughtfully. "It's like a big circle. You help someone, then they get better and help someone else, and it just keeps going." Thomas nodded. "That's exactly right. And speaking of helping others, I have something to show you." He pulled out a draft of a new program he was developing. Special training for medical staff about treating patients with compassion and understanding, especially those going through hard times. "I'm calling it the Maya Method," he said softly, "because you taught me that sometimes the best medicine isn't in a bottle or a surgical procedure. Sometimes it's just in seeing someone as a person who matters." Maya blushed, but her eyes sparkled with pride. "Can I help design it? I have lots of ideas." "Of course you can. In fact, I was hoping you'd help me present it to the hospital board next week. They need to hear from the expert on kindness herself." As they worked together on the presentation, Thomas's phone kept buzzing with messages from other hospitals interested in starting their own Bridge programs. The idea was spreading, just like the ripples from Maya's first act of kindness had spread through their community. Later that afternoon, as they walked past their old park bench on their way to get ice cream, they saw someone had placed a small plaque on it. It read, "Kindness begins here. Take a seat, make a friend, change a life." Maya squeezed Thomas's hand. "Look, our bench is famous now." Thomas laughed. "The bench isn't famous, sweetheart. The kindness that happened here is. And you know what? Every time someone sits here and reads that plaque, they'll think about being kind to someone else. That's how change happens, one person, one moment, one act of kindness at a time." 5 years passed, and the small ripple of kindness that started with a sandwich had grown into a wave of change. The children's hospital where Thomas worked had become famous for its Bridge program, which had now helped over 100 medical professionals return to their calling. But more importantly, it had sparked similar programs in hospitals across the country. Maya, now 16, stood at the podium of a national medical conference, her braids longer but her smile just as bright. Next to her stood Thomas, his hair now completely white, but his eyes twinkling with the same warmth. They had been invited to tell their story to thousands of healthcare professionals. "I was just 11 when I saw someone who needed help," Maya began, her voice clear and confident. "I didn't have much, just an extra sandwich and some time to listen. But sometimes that's all it takes to change someone's life." The audience sat captivated as she and Thomas took turns sharing their journey. They talked about the park bench that had become a symbol of hope in their community, about the countless lives touched by the Bridge program, about how one small act of kindness had created a movement. But the real magic, Thomas added, wasn't just in helping doctors and nurses return to medicine. It was in changing how we see each other. Every person who comes through our program learns the Maya Method, treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. After the conference, they returned home to find a surprise waiting. Their old park bench had been transformed into the centerpiece of a new community gathering space. The mayor had declared it the Kindness Corner, where people could find information about local assistance programs, share meals with those in need, or simply sit and talk. Maya's mom, now the head nurse at the community clinic, had organized a celebration. The whole neighborhood was there. The coffee shop owner who'd first offered Thomas a job, the librarian who'd helped him study, Dr. Chen who'd believed in his comeback, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by their story. But what made Maya and Thomas most proud were the new faces, people helping people, creating their own stories of hope and recovery. A former teacher who'd lost everything was now running literacy programs at the shelter. A chef who'd been homeless was teaching cooking classes at the community center. Each person who received help was inspired to help others in return. During the celebration, a young boy approached Maya with a notebook. "I want to be like you when I grow up," he said shyly. "Someone who helps people find their way back." Maya smiled, remembering her younger self. "You know what's wonderful?" she told him. "You don't have to wait to grow up to make a difference. Sometimes the smallest things, like sharing your lunch or just being kind, can change someone's whole world." Thomas watched this exchange with tears in his eyes. He thought about how far they'd come from that first autumn day. The girl who'd offered him half a sandwich was now preparing for medical school herself, inspired by the lives she'd helped change. As the sun set on their celebration, Maya and Thomas sat on their special bench one more time. The plaque had been joined by hundreds of small notes, messages of hope and gratitude from people whose lives had been touched by their story. "You know what I learned from all this," Maya said, looking at the gathering of people around them. "Kindness isn't just about helping others. It's about believing that everyone deserves a second chance, that nobody's story is over until they say it is." Thomas nodded, putting his arm around the shoulders of the young woman who'd saved his life with a simple act of kindness. And the most amazing part, we never know how far our kindness will reach. Look at all these people. Each one has their own story of falling down and getting back up, each one now helping others do the same. As darkness fell and lights twinkled on in the park, their bench stood as a reminder that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Their story had become more than just a tale of a sandwich shared between strangers. It had become a testament to the power of seeing the worth in every person, of believing in second chances, and of the extraordinary impact that ordinary kindness can have on the world.